Hey guys, Steve here at SKS Props. Today we're going to finish up my Warhammer 40K Ork Choppa. Welcome to the shop. If you're new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button because I'm coming back with lots more tips and tricks for prop and costume fabrication. In today's video, we have part 2 of my Warhammer 40K Ork Choppa series. Now, if you didn't check out part 1, feel free to pause this video, go watch it, and then come back. Part 1 was all about foam fabrication techniques. This, of course, is made all out of my HD foam, which you guys can find over at Blick Art Materials. I have links below. This is going to be part 2, which is going to go over all of the finishing techniques for sealing and painting. I'm going to show you guys what it takes to go from a raw weapon to a fully rendered work of art. We got a lot to do, so let's get started. So I've completed the fabrication process of my Warhammer 40K Ork Choppa, all made out of my HD foam, so it is con safe and extremely light. It is time to move on to painting and sealing, and to seal this foam I'm going to be using Plasti dip. It is currently freezing in my shop, and so I'm going to go inside, run some cans under warm water, and then try to heat up this area as much as possible so that the Plasti dip has the ability to cure properly. Remember that when you are applying Plasti dip, to do it in a well-ventilated area and make sure to wear your respirator. Now I'm laying down the Plasti dip in a continuous stream, and this will minimize the amount of texture that builds up. After layer 1 has semi-cured, I go ahead and add layer 2 to the weapon. By applying the Plasti dip in a few thin layers, it's giving me a smooth surface and not obscuring any of my details. After I'm done applying my layers, I hang it up near my sanding station with a fan on it so it can fully cure. Krylon Ultra Flat Black Primer is then applied to the weapon. This is to give the subsequent layers of paint something to bite into. Just like the Plasti dip, you want to apply the black primer in thin layers. You don't want to put it on too thick because that will cause it to run. Once the primer has dried, we can move on to our first base color, and this is going to be using the Rust-Oleum series Antique Pewter. Now this is a hammered metal, but I'm not going to put it on thick enough to do that chemical reaction. I just want the silver to lightly coat the surface. Now I am using different brands of rattle can here on top of each other. You want to make sure that if you're going to do this, you test it out first because some paints react harshly to each other. Now I'm spraying on the red very sporadically. I'm not intentionally trying to cover the entire surface because this is an orc weapon. I want it to look pretty rustic. To start my first wash, I'm using Liquitex Heavy Body Mars Black and a 1-inch mop brush. I'm adding a lot of water to this mixture because I want the paint to really get down into all the details that I've created. Adding a wash like this to your prop, make sure that the additional layers of acrylic that we're going to apply later adhere properly. Now once your wash is completely covered, go ahead and go back with a slightly damp paper towel and remove a lot of the excess paint. Because of the amount of water that I used in this step, I usually go in with a hairdryer to speed up the drying process. Using a 1/2-inch flat brush, I go in with more of the Liquitex Mars Black. Now I'm not adding near as much water this time around because I want this to be very opaque to cover all of the hoses. This black paint mixture is also used to cover the faux leather wrapped handle. Switching over to a 3/4-inch flat brush, I start to work on the details on the front of the weapon. Now I didn't know how dark I wanted this section to be, so I started off pretty light, but ended up adding a lot more pigment down the road. Now when I'm painting on a prop, I'm constantly changing the direction and angle of the bristles, that way it will minimize brush strokes. Using a metal ruler, I start laying out the lines that will make up the checkered pattern for the side of the weapon. Now for this weapon, I decided that the checkered pattern should be about 1 inch square. I don't want these checkers to be perfect because I think it would ruin the aesthetic of the weapon, so I'm going in with some watered down Mars Black and just kind of blocking out where they should go. Once I'm happy with the overall shape and size, I go back in with some thicker paint and start to fill them in. To paint the white portions of the checkers, I'm using a 1/2-inch flat brush and Liquitex Heavy Body Parchment. Even at that point, I thought they were still a little too neat, so I found a brush that had seen some better days, and I started to pull the white paint over some of the black boxes. And because this is a 3-dimensional prop, you do need to paint it and weather it from all angles. I go back with my hairdryer to make sure the surface is completely dry. This is very important because I'm going to go back with a brush and scrub a lot of this white and black paint off to give it a very battle-worn look. To achieve this weathered technique, I'm using a brush with very short bristles and I'm scrubbing fairly hard. To wipe away the excess, I'm using a slightly damp paper towel. This will minimize the amount of paint that gets moved around the surface. Just like with battle damage, I'm trying to figure out where and why the paint would be chipped away. But you can see that scrubbing down through that top layer really gives that paint a chipped effect. Moving on to the main body of the weapon, I'm using a 1/2 inch mop brush with some Liquitex cadmium-free red. Now I'm applying this in a stipple technique and feathering it to minimize my brush strokes. You will see a lot of my painting techniques are more than just applying the paint with a brush in a single motion. A lot of it has to do with the stippling or scrubbing of the paint, and this is really what gives it that unique feel. To accent more of that chipped look around the perimeter of the weapon, I go in with a 1/2 inch filbert brush and apply more of the cadmium red. Here I'm wanting the bristles to do their job, so I'm pulling the paint in a vertical direction. To continue the layered look of these paints, I go in with a flat brush and some watered down Mars Black, and I tidy up the black checkers a little bit. As with any of my builds, I'm constantly looking at the prop from all kinds of different angles. Once I'm satisfied with how it's going, I can move on to my next step. Moving on, I'm going to start to work on all the silver metallic parts of this weapon, and to do that I'm using Liquitex Heavy Body Rich Silver. I'm using a 1/2 inch filbert brush to apply my Liquitex Rich Silver, and I'm doing this in a very light-handed technique. I don't want to cover up the black that I had on there, I still want some of that to show through. Iridescent Rich Silver is a fairly opaque metallic. You don't want to add any water to it, and a little bit goes a long way. Using a detail brush, I can start painting all of the little bolts, rivets, and metal clasps all over the piece. You can tell on a lot of these that the red and the black that was previously applied still shows through, and this gives the color a lot of depth. Moving on to the handguard, I'm using some of the iridescent rich silver to highlight over the wash that we had done in the very beginning. This same technique is also applied to the teeth while still allowing a lot of the colors from beneath to still show through. A second layer of the iridescent rich silver was applied to the very edge of the teeth to create a highlight. To give this piece a very rusty, dirty look, I'm using one of my favorite paints, that's Liquitex Raw Sienna. This color is great for giving a rusty color to any of the metallic pieces. Raw Sienna is pretty thin, so my first pass is just to lay down the color in some areas that I'd like to have some contrast. And just like the cadmium red, I'm using the bristles on the brush to give the paint a directional pull. When you're applying this color to achieve a rust technique, always think about the fact that you're going to have a lot of buildup around nuts and bolts and in nooks and crannies that wouldn't normally get cleaned. And just like any technique that you could apply to a prop, a little bit goes a long way, so you don't want to overdo it. Once the first layer has been applied, I then can go in with a second pass and start to build up areas that I want to have more contrast. A very light application of the Raw Sienna is applied directly over the Mars Black of the handle. This will just give it a dusty look. When it comes to painting any of my props, it's all about the layers, and in this case we're going back with some more iridescent rich silver to highlight some of the metal as though the rust has been scraped off. One trick is to use this side of the brush instead of the bristles. This will give you a really nice defined edge highlight. And again, because this paint is somewhat opaque, it can be applied directly over the cadmium red to give it that scrape down to the metal look. Final highlights are applied to the handguard in places that would be relatively clean and on the tips of the spikes. Dry brushing techniques are pretty much used all for this look because we're just trying to capture the edge of what's there. Final painting step is to go in with a detailed brush and a little bit of Mars Black and fill in all the cracks and battle damage that I had put in earlier. so you guys can see what it takes to paint a fully rendered Warhammer 40K Ork Choppa. Now, once again, I have free templates for this over in the description section, so download it, make it yourself. And if you are building any of my builds or using EVA Foam, be sure to tag me on Twitter and Instagram because I love seeing the progress. Now, hopefully you guys learned something from this video, and if you did, give me a thumbs up. And until next time, thanks for stopping by.